My son didn't know I was watching when they changed the locks. He was sitting on the front steps of the house he'd spent 3 years paying into, the house that was supposed to be his, with a cardboard box on his lap and his daughter asleep against his shoulder. She was 4 years old, and she had no idea what was happening. That's the part that stayed with me. She was just sleeping, her little mouth open, one shoe half on, completely trusting that the world was still okay. I pulled my truck to the curb and sat there for a minute before I got out. 3 years. That's how long I'd been carrying what I knew. 3 years of Sunday dinners and birthday cakes, and watching my son look at the man across the table like he was something to aspire to. 3 years of keeping my mouth shut because the timing wasn't right, because my son wasn't ready, because I needed to be sure. I was sure. I got out of the truck. My son looked up and I could see it. That look a grown man gets when he's trying not to cry in front of his father. He was 41 years old. He'd been through 2 tours, a divorce before this one, a business that almost broke him. He wasn't a soft man. But that afternoon, sitting on those steps with his daughter asleep on him, he looked exactly like he did when he was 7 and fell off his bike on Creekside Road and just sat there in the gravel not crying, just waiting for me to come. I said, "Let's go." He said, "Dad." "I know," I said. "Get in the truck." He didn't ask me what I knew. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe some part of him had always known that I knew something. Either way, he shifted his daughter into my arms and picked up the box, and we drove away from that house without looking back. What I'm about to tell you goes back further than that afternoon. It goes back to a Tuesday evening in March, almost 4 years prior, when my son called me from a restaurant parking lot to tell me he was getting married. I was happy for him. I want to be clear about that. When he described her, the way she laughed, the way she'd argued with him about something small and then apologized immediately, genuinely, which he said was rare in his experience. I believed him. I believed he'd found something real. I met her 2 weeks later at a dinner in Nashville, where they'd been living. She was pretty and composed and said all the right things. She asked about my work. She asked about my late wife. She touched my son's hand when she thought I wasn't watching, and it looked like affection. Her father arrived 40 minutes late. I noticed that. I noticed the way the table shifted when he walked in, the way my son straightened up, the way she stopped mid-sentence. I noticed the way he sat down without apologizing for being late, poured his own water, and looked at me the way some men look at things they're deciding whether to buy. His name was Clifton Hargrove. He ran a property investment company out of Brentwood. Old money dressed up as new money. The kind of man who says we when he means I and opportunity when he means advantage. He shook my hand and said he'd heard a lot about me. I said I couldn't say the same. He smiled like that was a joke. It wasn't. My son was an architect. A good one, the kind who wins regional awards and gets called back by clients, not the kind who chases commissions. He'd built his firm from nothing after his first marriage fell apart, and by the time he met her, he had 6 employees and more work than he could handle. He had something valuable, a reputation. What he didn't have was Clifton Hargrove's kind of money. And I think, in Clifton's mind, that created an imbalance he never fully accepted. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, not just filed away, was about 8 months into the marriage. My son called me on a Wednesday night, sounding tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He said Clifton had been asking questions about his firm, about his clients, about a mixed-use development project he'd been contracted to design on the east side of Nashville. "What questions?" I asked. "Just curious stuff," my son said. "You know how he is." I did know how he was. "What did you tell him?" "Just general stuff. Nothing confidential. I didn't push it that night, but I wrote it down. That's something I started doing around that time. Keeping a small notebook. Nothing dramatic. Just dates, what was said, who was in the room. My wife used to tease me about my memory, said I could recall every license plate I'd ever seen but forgot our anniversary twice. She wasn't wrong. The notebook was a habit from my working years, when I managed contracts for a mid-sized construction firm, and learned early that the difference between a misunderstanding and a lawsuit was almost always documentation. Over the next year, I filled up 2 notebooks. The questions Clifton asked my son moved from general to specific in a way that probably felt gradual to my son, but was obvious to me when I read my own notes back. Client names, zoning disputes, who on the city planning board my son knew personally, whether a certain developer had ever reached out to him directly. My son answered all of it. He's not naive. He's just trusting in a way that I've always thought was one of his best qualities and one of his most dangerous ones. The second thing I noticed was about 18 months in. My daughter-in-law started coming to family dinners alone. Little explanations, always reasonable. Clifton had a conflict. Clifton was traveling. Clifton sends his love. But Clifton never sent his love in person after a certain point, and I started to wonder why. The answer came from an unlikely place. I have a friend. We served together briefly, decades ago, and we've stayed in touch the way men do when they've seen each other in bad situations, which is to say not often but honestly. He'd spent the latter part of his career in financial compliance. We met for coffee in Murfreesboro last spring, just to catch up, and I mentioned Clifton's name without any particular intention. My friend got quiet. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't recognize a name. The other kind. He said he couldn't tell me much, but he told me enough. Clifton Hargrove had been under informal scrutiny for something related to a land deal in Williamson County. Nothing charged, nothing proven, but the kind of scrutiny that makes careful people start repositioning their assets. I drove home very slowly that afternoon, because here's what I understood, sitting in that truck on I-24 with the radio off. Clifton had recruited my son. Not deliberately, maybe not even consciously at first. But my son's firm was legitimate, well-regarded, and connected to the exact networks Clifton needed access to. And my son, who loved his wife and wanted to make a good impression on her father, had been answering questions for 18 months. I didn't say anything to my son. Not yet. I needed to know more, and I needed to know it in a way that was solid, not just a feeling and some notes in a spiral notebook. So I did something I'm not sure my son would have approved of. I hired someone, a woman who did private investigative work, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, the practical kind. Background research, financial record review, document verification. She came recommended by my former employer's attorney, and she was thorough and discreet and cost me more than I wanted to think about. It took 4 months. What she found wasn't a smoking gun. It was more like a pattern, the kind you only see when you lay everything flat and look at it from a distance. Clifton had used intermediaries to funnel information about development projects into investment decisions that benefited a small group of people, none of whom were my son. The projects my son had described to Clifton, innocently, in conversation, had preceded land purchases in those same areas by an average of 6 weeks. My son hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't known. But he had been used. I sat with that information for 2 weeks before I decided what to do with it. Not because I was uncertain, but because I was angry, and I've learned over 63 years that anger is useful fuel and terrible navigation. I needed to be calm before I moved. There was something else, too. Something that complicated everything. My granddaughter. She'd been born 14 months into the marriage. My son had been in the delivery room. He'd called me from the hospital at 2 in the morning, voice cracking, and said her name, a name they'd chosen together. And I'd sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and felt the particular joy that I think only grandparents fully understand. But around the time my investigator was finishing her report, my daughter-in-law's behavior changed in a way I couldn't ignore. She started asking questions too. Not about business. About my son directly, his schedule, whether he'd mentioned speaking with anyone from a certain contractor's office, whether he'd been looking at his firm's financials recently. She asked me some of these questions at a birthday dinner, casual, over cake, and I gave her vague answers the way I'd learned to give Clifton vague answers, and afterward I sat in my truck in their driveway and stared at the steering wheel. I thought about my son inside, washing dishes, completely unaware. I thought about my granddaughter upstairs, asleep. I thought about what I was going to have to do, and when, and how badly it was going to hurt him. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is not important. He's been my attorney for 17 years, and the most important thing about him is that he is not the kind of man who tells you what you want to hear. He listened to everything I laid out, the notebooks, the investigator's report, the timeline, the questions, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The prenup. What about it?" I said, "Does your son still have a copy?" He did. I knew he did because I'd been the one, 3 years earlier, who told him to get one. He hadn't wanted to. He said it felt like planning for failure. I told him that planning for failure was how you survived it. He'd gotten one, reluctantly, and filed it away somewhere in his office at home. My attorney said we needed to get that document reviewed before anything else happened. He said I needed to stop talking to my daughter-in-law about anything related to my son's work. He said I needed to document any future questions she asked, the same way I'd been documenting Clifton's. And then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this gets worse before it gets better. I said I understood. He said, no, I mean, there may be things that come out that you're not ready for. I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't say specifically, but his tone told me enough. The thing I wasn't ready for came out 6 weeks later, through my investigator, who had followed a thread I hadn't asked her to follow. The kind of thing good investigators do when they notice something adjacent to what they're looking for. My granddaughter's biological father was not my son. I'm going to pause here because I think you need to understand something about how I received that information. I was standing in my kitchen. It was a Thursday morning. I had coffee on the counter, and the radio was playing something low. My investigator told me over the phone, carefully, and I said, say that again, not because I hadn't heard her, but because I needed a moment for my brain to process it as real. She said it again. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest with you. My first thought was not about justice or evidence or what to do next. My first thought was about the way my granddaughter had looked at my son the previous Easter. The way she'd called for him from across the yard. Just Dad, the simplest word, and he'd gone immediately, without hesitation, the way fathers do. That's the image I kept coming back to in the days that followed. Not Clifton, not the land deals, not the deception. That small girl calling across a yard, and my son going. I didn't tell my son right away. I want to be clear that this was the hardest decision I made in this entire situation. I have gone back and forth on it many times, even now. I chose to wait because I needed to understand the full picture first, and because I knew that the moment I told him, everything would accelerate in ways I couldn't control. What I know now, what I knew by the time I'd spoken with my attorney 3 more times and reviewed everything my investigator had compiled, is that the biological father was a man my daughter-in-law had known before the marriage, someone she'd stayed in contact with. The timing of my granddaughter's conception aligned with the period when my son had been working extended hours on a project in Memphis, gone 4 days a week for almost 2 months. My daughter-in-law had known from the beginning. She had not told my son. I think about the weight of that. Carrying that through a pregnancy, through a delivery room, through 3 years of holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings, and a small girl learning to walk and talk and ask questions about why the sky is blue. I don't understand it. I stopped trying to. What I understood was what I needed to do. My attorney contacted Clifton's attorney, quietly, without my son's knowledge, and communicated, in the careful language attorneys use, that certain information had come to our attention and that it would be in everyone's interest to arrange an appropriate resolution before things became formal. Clifton's response was to change the locks. That's the thing about men like Clifton. They've spent their lives being the ones who move first, and when someone else moves first, they panic and reach for the only tool they know: force. He had my son removed from the marital home in under 48 hours. He told my daughter-in-law to take the child and stay with him. He told my son that the house was in his daughter's name and that he had no claim to it. That was a mistake. Not legally, that part I'll leave to the attorneys to explain. But tactically, it was a mistake, because it took the decision out of my son's hands and put it into mine. And by then I had 4 months of documentation, a certified investigator's report, a well-reviewed prenuptial agreement, and 17 years of trust in an attorney who does not lose. My son called me from the curb 30 minutes after they changed the locks. I was already in the truck. I told you earlier that he didn't ask me what I knew that first night. That's true. But about a week later, when we were sitting at my kitchen table and my granddaughter was asleep in the back bedroom, he looked at me and said, "How long?" I said, "Long enough." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you would have confronted him, and you would have done it before we were ready." He was quiet. Then he said, "That's probably true." "I know it is," I said. He smiled, just barely. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was something. I told him about the land deals that night. Everything. The notebooks, the investigator, what my friend from Murfreesboro had told me, what it all added up to. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him, which told me he was in shock in the particular way that happens when things you suspected, but never said out loud, are confirmed. When I finished, he said, "She was asking me questions too, wasn't she?" "It wasn't really a question." "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee, put it back down. He said, Is there more? There was, and that part I told him differently, not all at once, not at the kitchen table. That part I told him over 3 or 4 conversations, over as many days, starting gently and giving him time to sit with it before the next layer. I don't know if that was the right approach. I just know it's what I chose. By the end of those conversations, he'd heard everything. He didn't say much after the last one. He went out to the back porch and sat there for about an hour. I checked on him twice, and he just shook his head, and I left him to it. Some things a man has to go through without an audience. When he came back in, he said, "She's still mine." I didn't ask him to clarify. I knew exactly who he meant. What followed was long and ugly in the way legal proceedings always are. Clifton had resources, and he used them. He hired attorneys. He filed motions. He made things take longer than they should have. But the information we had was solid, and my attorney had been through harder cases with worse odds, and there's a particular kind of satisfaction in watching a man who has spent his career being the one with leverage discover that someone got to the leverage first. The fraud case against Clifton was filed by a third party, a developer who, with the help of some pointed introductions from my attorney, was finally in a position to move formally on what he'd long suspected. I won't take credit for that. I'll say only that information has a way of reaching the right people when you stop keeping it to yourself. The marriage ended. That was not a surprise to anyone, I think, including my son, though he grieved it in the way you grieve something you wanted to work even after you knew it wouldn't. The custody arrangement took longer. There was a period, I won't pretend otherwise, when things were uncertain. My daughter-in-law's attorney tried to use the paternity question as leverage, to suggest that my son's claim to my granddaughter was diminished by biology. I sat in the back of that courtroom and listened to that argument, and kept my face very still. The judge did not agree with that argument. What the judge said, and I'm summarizing, not quoting, because the exact words belong to that courtroom and not to me, was that 3 years of daily presence, of commitment, of a child who calls you dad and reaches for you when she's frightened, constitutes something that biology does not automatically override. My son has primary custody. She spends time with her mother. Those arrangements are still being worked out in the way these things are, imperfectly, with adjustments. Clifton's legal situation is ongoing. I'll leave it at that. My granddaughter is 5 now. She started kindergarten this fall. Real kindergarten. The first day with the backpack and the new shoes and the photograph in front of the door. My son texted me the photo at 7:43 in the morning, and I looked at it for a long time before I responded. She was grinning, both shoes on. My son was crouched down next to her, and he was grinning too, the same grin he's had since he was a kid, the one that's slightly lopsided on the left side. I texted back, "She looks like she owns the place." He sent back a laughing emoji, then "She does. Gets it from Grandpa." I set my phone down and sat for a while with that. There are things I got wrong in all of this. I know that. I kept information from my son for longer than was comfortable, and while I believe my reasoning was sound, I can't be entirely sure it was right. I made decisions on his behalf without asking him. That's a line I crossed, and I crossed it knowingly, and I think he's forgiven me for it in the way sons forgive fathers. Not all at once, but incrementally, in the small things. He calls me most mornings now. Not about anything important, usually. The news, the weather, something his daughter said that made him laugh. That's the thing about losing the life you thought you were building. Sometimes what you find in the wreckage is simpler and more solid than what you lost. I think about Clifton sometimes. Not with anger, not anymore. More with something like pity, which I know sounds like a luxury, but is actually just the thing that's left after anger exhausts itself. He built something impressive, and then destroyed it, because he couldn't tolerate the idea of someone else having something he didn't control. I've known men like that my whole life. I've watched them all end up in the same place. What I know, what I believe now more than I did before any of this started, is that family is not the thing you're born into. It's the thing you show up for. It's the Tuesday evenings and the school drop-offs and the phone calls that don't have a point. It's sitting on a porch in the dark while your son works through something terrible, and not saying a word, and being there when he comes back inside. My granddaughter called me last Sunday. She does this sometimes, picks up her dad's phone, and calls people. She just wanted to tell me that she'd lost a tooth. I told her that was the most important news I'd heard all week. She laughed and said, "Grandpa, you're silly." She's right. I am, and I wouldn't change a single thing.